once again to Haus der Kunst for what is really the coda of several months of discussions and debates we've had around this truly remarkable exhibition downstairs. Anatsui Triumphant Scale runs until the 28th of July, after which we send it on tour. It goes to Mataf, Arab Museum of Modern Art in Doha, Kunstmuseum Bern, and then finally, at the end of next year, the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And although it's going to be rather sad to see the exhibition go, I've had the privilege of being able to walk into those spaces every single day. I don't think it would go too far to say that the reaction from the public, both here in Munich and abroad, has been nothing short of phenomenal. It is incredible every day to see people walking out of that exhibition completely amazed by what they've seen. And as I've mentioned, we've had so many guests who have come by and who have lent their thoughts and lent their perspectives to the exhibition. We began with Francis Queré doing a talk and tour through the spaces. We've had Nadine Ziegert, we had Bonaventure and Kuring and Simon Jami, maybe debate and fight here on this stage not long ago. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome back to Munich Sir David Adjaye to deliver the keynote address. As I'm sure many of you know, Sir David Adjaye is recognized as one of the leading architects of his generation. Born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, to Ghanaian parents who were diplomats, Adjaye spent his formative years in Africa and the Middle East until his family relocated to the United Kingdom in 1979. His education at South Bank University and then the Royal College of Art in London honed his creative process. And since the opening his first studio in 1994 with William Russell, Adjaye's broad-ranging influences, ingenious use of materials, and sculptural ability have established him as an architect with an artist's sensibility and vision. In 2000, he founded Adjaye Associates, which now has offices in London, New York, and Accra, with projects in the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The largest of these projects to date was the $540 million Smithsonian Institution for National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in autumn of 2016. The museum was named Cultural Event of the Year by the New York Times and the Beasley Design of the Year by the Design Museum. Other prominent completed projects include the Ideas Store in London in 2005, which is credited as pioneering a new approach to library services. The Nobel Peace Center in Oslo also opened in 2005. The Museum of Contemporary Art Denver, 2007. The Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo, 2010. And the Sugar Hill Mixed-Use Social Housing Scheme in Harlem, New York in 2015. Ongoing projects include a new home for the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, the National Museum of Slavery and Freedom in Cape Coast in Ghana, the recently announced National Cathedral of Ghana in Accra, and the National Holocaust Museum and Learning Centre in London. Of course, for many of us here, two of Adjaye's probably most famous projects, so to speak, would first be the 2015 exhibition, David Adjaye, Form, Heft and Material, here at Haus der Kunst. And of course, I'm sure many of you have already seen the incredible Ghanaian pavilion at this year's Venice Biennial, featuring artists, amongst whom, of course, Anatsui has produced 3 absolutely wonderful works. The way this evening will go is David will come up and he will give a very sort of, he'll give a presentation, but he wants it to keep very informal. He wants it to be more like a sort of conversation, a Q&A. So David will give his presentation and then we're just going to open the floor to questions. So please think of questions. But without further ado, it is my very great pleasure to welcome David Adjaye to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I really hate keynote addresses. So I'm going to do a little workshop with you, which is just sort of going through notes and thoughts, because I think that you've probably, if you've been following the show, which is truly one of the greatest shows I've seen in my life, you probably know a lot about all the things that you should know about Elle. But Elle for me was somebody who I came across very early in my work as a young student. And it came as a way of trying to find narratives that I could dive into that would allow me to understand how to work with it within the contemporary. I was very versed in the sort of the Western discourse of art making from, the classical period, the Renaissance to the contemporary, but really looking for the kind of the rebirth of a kind of contemporary vision. Elle was one of the kind of giants that really was very important to me. And when I now know Elle very well, having worked with him on several things, and he's working with me on the Cathedral of Ghana, which we are very excited about. I'm going to just really take you through a series of points and quotes and then show you some images. I'm not trying to make anything large out of the images, but I hope that at the end they'll give you a sort of body, because I sort of have my feeling about the beginnings of this incredible man are just I have a hunch about where he's sort of going and the incredible freedom that he's made for himself in his work. I will also show little bits of my work, not in any way to compare myself to him in any way, but just to show the kind of moments where certain ideas that he's had really had a kind of profound effect on the way in which I look at certain thematics in my work too. Of course, this man, born in 1944, just before colonization, is, for me, this extraordinary statement that he's one of 32 children born by his parents. So that was the first thing that is like a kind of hit to my radar, and I was like, wow, let's just start there. I don't even know if we have any language for what a 32nd child has to deal with in terms of negotiating who they are in the world. But that's the lineage of the pre-colonial period of families in West Africa, and the idea of just children being the kind of critical sort of treasure of the family, and coming from a good family, being able to produce so many children. Clearly, the family must have been able to secure that. I think that obviously this period is obviously the critical period to really understand. And I recently was lucky enough to go to Nsukka, the university, to visit Elle at his he doesn't teach there anymore, but he's sort of a kind of professor emeritus, as it were, and to see the school and the way he's revered in the school. But I think that you don't understand Elle if you don't really look very critically at this period with the Nsukka group and Uche Okeke's work. Uche Okeke, those of you who don't know, is probably the most important, I would say probably one of the most important painters, thinkers, post-war thinkers from Nigeria, who really is the father of the sort of Nsukka group, becomes the figurehead, and really becomes one of the kind of key attractors for Elle to go to leave Ghana after studying at Kumasi and really dealing with the whole, you've got to imagine this world of the post-colonial where independence has happened and everybody's struggling to find a way to kind of add to the language of what it means to become a nation. So a lot of the teaching is colonial. So Kumasi School, which is the important school and still is the important school where people like Ibrahim Mahama comes from now, it's a school that was at that time teaching a kind of classical tradition, Western tradition, and then is starting to search for new voices, but at that time had not found it. And in Nsukka, with this group, had sort of birthed this extraordinary energy and direction, really derived from essentially Uche's deep investigation into the Uli tradition. And those of you so this is just looking at sort of that time for Elle as this young person, but I don't know if you know about Uli or Bamun or Vai or Nsibi, and these are our Dinkra. These are all these systems of language that exist in West Africa that are the codification language of rituals and of the kings and of many, also used in the military and used, as a kind of text and sort of subtext. And in a way, what Uche Okeke does is to kind of understand within these semantics that there is a kind of language in here that can be used with the collision of modernism to create or to begin to explore a new language. And I'm really fascinated by this period and this time and this form, and I'm sort of, in a way, a generation much later, thinking about the kind of repercussions of this in even my own work. The evidence is clear in all of L's scribbles, and I think there's a very beautiful moment in the show when you see the back wall and you see L's scribbles, and I think that L scribbles not just a scribble, but he's making a direct reference in a relationship to this work, and this idea of the notation or the pictogram or the kind of notation of form that is encoded in the way in which you make things. Sorry, this thing's so I kind of wanted to really take us back to understanding a bit of this. And Uli is very important to people like Uche and, the artists like Obere, Ojeche, Ole, Owibe, all these characters, and, even right through to Damas Nokwo, who's an incredible architect that kind of works in Nigeria. There's a whole sort of gang of them. But they fall in love with this because, one, it is the language of Uli kind of applied almost in a kind of free jazz spirit by women to create narratives on sculpture, on bodies, it's face painted, on architecture, and women are seen to be the creators because they seem to be the ones who own art, the creative force, the fertile force. And they're really inspired by this, and so these men now want to kind of enter this arena and sort of use this form. This is a kind of recent image of Uli work. So Uli's been going on for a long, long time, and this free form of the language into abstraction is a powerful message. Of course, this is Nsukka University now, and it's still an important school and teaching environment where a lot of students are now. It's interesting to go there now and see the way in which the teachers and the school kind of work from these narratives and move forward. Another thing to kind of note is after this very famous conference in 1962, the historic conference on African writers of English expression at the Makerere College in Kampala, where there's this kind of incredible, huge fight and discourse between, rejecting Europe or finding a kind of medium term. It birthed this very important club, the Mubarak Club, which is where a lot of the action happens. I mean, I was at the Royal College, and the bar was the most important place. Not the building, not the place. The bar is where, I met Chris Afili, met, the Jake and Dennis Chapman, all these characters, etc. And in a way, this bar is really the kind of the spot where discourses about the Western literary tradition, how do you accept it passively, do you mold it, do you work within a new post-colonial condition? And people like Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, all these characters, Demas Nokwa, as I talk about, and even people like Ibrahim El Salah, who's like just being rediscovered, that incredible show at the Tate, were all hanging out here. So I think that's also a kind of fascinating backdrop. And then, of course, and I love to show, look at Uche's work. Uche's extraordinary kind of, if you look at Uli and then look at what Uche does with his kind of works, and some of the other artists that are in the sort of studios of Nsukka and the way in which they're trying to interpret this Uli language. And, and it's very, very straight and direct and about this kind of way in which you move through it. I mean, if you look at Uli and the culture of Vai or Bauman, it goes into sculpture. As I said, and you look at Adinkra, it's textile, etc. I'm not showing that for you, but you can see what happens. And then you see somebody, the kind of creative power and force of L, who doesn't want to just work as a traditional, doesn't want to be labeled as anybody within any specific tradition, but moves and creates a new form that is both sculpture, social practice, painting, everything. He sort of welds everything together, not wanting to choose. And to visit his studio is one of the most incredible things if ever any of you might get a chance, because it's really an extraordinary moment of seeing how he brings young people and people that have been in with him for decades to work on the projects, and they become incredibly skilled. And it's a kind of dialogue, it's a free-form dialogue where he's almost a sort of conductor, where he sets up scenarios and then looks at scenarios and effects. And it's great talking to you about the way the show went up and how improvisation is not a sort of, improvisation is a kind of force that is to be, what's the word? To be mastered in order, like Coltrane talks about, to be mastered in order to be, so that it's a kind of fluid system that kind of flows through the idea of making. Some of the early work that I was really fascinated with the ceramic voids, and ceramic voids not literally for me in their idea, but just in listening to what Elle talked about, this idea of the broken, let me just, as I said, this is a working experiment, so forgive me as I go across papers. Where's the middle? So actually, sorry, before I got into parts, I should have read this. I have been working with Ghanaian Adinkra symbols printed on cloths for a long time. These symbols are very intriguing to me because they refer to proverbs, but also they try to graphically encapsulate abstract concepts such as the soul, facility, God's omnipotence, and so on. I found that an extraordinary statement that kind of talks about it. And then in the pots, which is where I am here, at the time I made the Broken Pot series, I was thinking about the idea of breaking not as an end, but as a beginning. When a pot breaks, as a ceramicist, you can grind the pieces into clay for fresh substance, which becomes stronger as a result. But when I made these pots, Ghana's economy was completely in tatters. In retrospect, I regard my process as an exhortation that things have to break in order to start reshaping. And this idea of things having to break to reshape as a kind of within the context of a colonial, post-colonial edge, but also as a way of reading context, that the work is not about the kind of artist in the mind, but the work as a kind of process of reflection became really fascinating to me in my search to try and find a way to make form. And my first project ever was this project called the Elektra House. And in a way, I wanted to make a project that was nothing to do with the statement of the architect making a form, but a way to read a condition of a Victorian city, a Victorian street, but an old warehouse building which had fallen into disrepair. Two artists bought it, and in a way to try and find a form over the existing ruin or the existing sort of profile, not so much ruin profile of the building. So it looks like a new building, but it's actually the kind of encasement of the kind of the phenomena of the form, where the form was supposed to be, it actually was broken. And then internally, you start to see the remnants of the walls, which then are then carved out and then replated with glass, sometimes showing voids and cavities that bring in a kind of life into the building. So in a way, the composition is, I always said, was sort of somehow self sort of authored, in the sense that it's, of course, interested in the way in which one uses cartography to draw, but it's also interested in the way in which one finds an existing condition and one brings one's own kind of narrative into the way in which one puts together form. And probably the most sort of articulate version of that was this one, which was the second project after the first one, which was called the Dirty House, where an old piano factory in the East End was bought by two artists. And I was very fascinated with this idea of leaving the building, the destroyed building, but to add a series of pieces that allow you to understand its width, its dimension, its scale, its form, its patina, by kind of coating the kind of readings of the city away from it, and creating different geometries, spaces that register the height of the building, that register the kind of horizontality of the form, and in a way compose to make a new phenomena as a volume. And then a third one, which sort of these three are the three sort of key projects of these kinds of reconstructions in my mind, but I use these thinkings, which was to use an old void, which is a loading dock, which gets turned into a home for a fashion designer and her husband. So the loading dock becomes a series of portals and courtyards that creates a series of chambers that are sometimes open, sometimes closed, and always about this kind of dark presence that kind of blurs the way in which you understand what's outside, what's inside, etc. And then, learning about the wooden pieces, which was sort of a second period of his work, and this idea of artists being able to work with different periods and different forms was also really profoundly impactful to me. That actually, unlike architects, an artist can move into another series, another body, and it's part of the kind of unfolding. So I was really fascinated that the man that was working in the different sort of spheres we knew could suddenly shift into these forms. And the wood pieces were fascinating to me, this idea of the Uli drawings somehow attacking, ascribing, kind of putting a kind of narrative about histories, about the time on the continent, the conflicts and the tensions into the body of these timbers was just completely gripping when I started to see these works. And of course, you have this extraordinary piece here right now, and this piece, which was for me a really profound piece, of course, surviving children. This idea of kind of driftwood from boats, waterfront, etc., sort of being composed back into compositions. I started a whole series of timber things, and it was kind of almost directly a reference, but nobody ever saw it, and it was a quiet thing. So I started to make these timber constructions, which were just about, I call them pavilions, but they were really about the emotional state, and they were really about searching for the center. This was a pavilion that was for me about what is the meaning of what I'm trying to do, and these were like these corridors that were on the periphery of a kind of space which had this color spectrum sort of center. And then it moved into the public. Those were in exhibition spaces. And then it moved into the public with this pavilion, which was made as a kind of a homage to the sort of noise of the city. Ironically, it became an object of spectacle in its own right, and this is a real picture that was taken. But there are other photos where it was basically this idea of trying to make within the city and the kind of noise of London a temple, again, to the ordinary. And that was to do with my kind of own sort of reaction to my time living in London and wanting to kind of find a kind of solace or a space. So it was designed as this kind of wood sort of phenomena that would try to kind of create that engagement. I've sort of been working on it and still work in this medium. And it's a series of works that just happen parallel to the making of buildings and to the making of what I call works that are to do with reconfiguring the city, or works which are to do with sort of memorials and memory, which is another strand that I've sort of become fascinated with. So again, looking at it again, another one which is, they now appear in different parts of the world. This is in Miami, and this idea of these wood sort of interpretations which start to kind of engage with different contexts and different forms of narratives about the city and the time. And then lastly, when the kind of monumental works started to appear, I mean, we were all just sort of, our minds were blown, or my mind was blown, that suddenly the audacity of the ability to move out of the museum and the gallery and to create a sort of, the audacity of Elle's incredible sort of creative power and prowess to to feel so confident as to be able to kind of want to kind of reprogram, for me as an architect, looking at it as an architect's eye, reprogram the built environments with these installations. That they are literally as kind of attempts, they're narratives about the world, we can go through them, the narratives about form and color, we know these that you have, but these kind of extraordinary kind of moments to kind of try and come to the city. And these are just, and you have an extraordinary one which talks about the news and media as a kind of billboard, but these reconstructions for me were profound, and profound in the kind of idea of an artwork that is trying to do this. This is the Royal Academy reimagined, but the idea of the monumentality of this. So in a way, for me, they became new monuments, and as I started to see them and follow them, I became fascinated. In my own later work, I think it sort of indirectly, I only admit it now, that I think it started to really affect the way in which I started to look at my own work, and I kind of look at this piece, and then this piece, which I did. And I suddenly realized that there's a kind of, they're not literal, but I became obsessed with this kind of idea that somehow one could use a system to make form that was not simply about bricks and mortars, but about the aggregation of narrative. This is a kind of discussion about a place in Beirut and a kind of collection and a kind of crazy juxtaposition of elements, but to use a kind of narrative to kind of create form without necessarily making something that's opaque, but to aggregate and to use that to kind of bring together disparate parts. So there are 4 different sort of conditions in this building, and this thing is sort of making a new kind of frame building. And then, I mean, probably the most monumental of that is really, for me, the Smithsonian, where one kind of aggregates a kind of complex program into this new form, but creates it as a kind of a sort of gauze that kind of descends over the program of the museum, over the program of the content. And this is when the project is opening. And then I'm going to finish this this part of the conversation. Let's see. With this part, and he says, L argues that art grows out of each particular situation. I believe the artists are better off working with whatever their environment throws up. I don't think that working with prescribed materials would be very interesting to me, industrially produced colors or paintings. But I believe that color is inherent in everything, and he's talking about that. But it's something that really struck me is that you're better off picking something which relates to your circumstance and your environment as your practice. And that was really powerful. Anyway, luckily, a year ago, about 3 years ago, I started working in Ghana, and have a practice there and doing various scales of work. But the Venice Biennale project, the idea of making a Ghana pavilion really came up very much in a conversation with the late director of this institution, Okwi and Weza. It felt like it was the time to try and see, with this new president who had very much a kind of vision about how the arts would support the sort of the growth of the nation, as it were, of Ghana. We felt that this was maybe a moment to talk to him. So Okwi and I had a conversation, and then I went to make a presentation to the president and his executive team about going for this thing, that it was absurd because there were so many things on his table, but this idea of understanding the power of the arts and the extraordinary lineage, and Elle was a very important example in showing why that this needed to happen. Was part of the kind of the sort of discussion to him, and thankfully he felt the kind of urgency of the project and decided to allow us to make this this pitch. And obviously with Okwi's help, which I think it would have been, well, not I think, I know it would have been impossible without his help. We made a proposal to the Biennale and started working. And Nana Foriata Ayim, the curator, was selected to join. And really, we set out to try and make something which really spoke about, hopefully, I think, the impact of what that generation of artists from Elle's time had started, and to also show a kind of line. So the pavilion is not just a kind of moment to just show an artist or something, but it was to really show that since 1957, since independence, and this kind of extraordinary beginning and rethinking of what does art from specifically West Africa, I think, kind of mean, that there was a generation of flourishing artists that were working both at home and abroad, coming from the kind of great work and the impact of Elle to show a kind of lineage of this trajectory of the last 60 years. So in the end, sort of in very deep conversation with Okui, the idea was to select three women, 3 men, 6 artists, and to use Elle as really the kind of, as the sort of, I will talk about this in a second, the structure, but the idea of 6 artists and in a way two bookends. Elle as the sort of the godfather of this kind of Ghanaian generation anyway, specifically, and then looking at somebody like the work of Mahama Ibrahim, a new artist who learns very much from Elle, but is doing a very different kind of work about archiving. And so he's looking at the time in which people like Elle were in and recoding that as work to then kind of challenge and look at the kind of condition of now. And that is fascinating. So we said that a kind of bookend of these two would be powerful. And then to look at the painters, Lynette Boyke, and a kind of one of the Felicia Aban, a sort of early photographer of independence Ghana, John Okomfra, the sort of videographer, and Selassie, a new sort of video installation artist in this new composition. The thinking was to see if we could, I wanted to see if we could make, literally take the narrative that Elle always talks about, the context as a generator of, or the thinking as a kind of the origin as a kind of generator of the kind of contemporary, and to see if one could make something that talks about the pre-colonial, the classical, that then is the kind of bedrock and the basis from which the different varieties of this art are springing from, in a way to go back to a kind of heart, but not to make it literally. So I sought in this sketch to try and find a way to make almost like a kind of uli form, which talked about a sort of the idea of the heart, the inhabitation, without actually doing it, and then to make it a 3-dimensional form. And to see if that 3-dimensional form could then inhabit a series of elliptical chambers, which would then create the opportunity for the different artists to have either sort of tempieta moments, temple-like, shrine-like moments, or exhibition moments, but ones that were absolutely against the kind of geometry of the white cube, but were about trying to talk about the kind of struggle to kind of create a new identity within the kind of canon of a trajectory which is so sort of already understood. So it went back to the soil, the laterite, which is the basis of kind of all the enclosure, and indirectly referencing the classical, but really this idea of the laterite and this interiority. And then the different artists are displayed in it. In the heart of it, so in the center, is Felicia Aban's kind of photographic work of the 50s and 60s and 70s, looking at women, the body, that actually that period we're so used to looking at the image of men, but this woman was very interested in the image of women from independence to now. And that archive is so important now to understand the evolution of the image of women. And she included herself in self-portraits, but in a very different narrative. And then if you look at the work of the narratives of Lynette and her free-thinking imaginations of the presence of the black body in the narrative of painting. And then Elle did these incredible works. We thought we would get maybe one piece, and like you find that when Elle sort of, I went to see him in Nsukka, and And he was like, I'm really doing this show at House de Kunst. And we thought, we know, but, whatever you can do. So he then produced these monumental pieces, which talk about the bending of time. He calls this the sort of bending of time, the opening and bending of time, which is a completely new work of which you see a new piece in the exhibition. And then a kind of melancholic sort of piece about sort of, in a way, it's a song about the memories, but really for me, it's about the kind of, for me, it's a memory piece about the time of sort of the post-colonial period. And then this extraordinary work, which he said, was this kind of opening statement that you came into, and he called it the earth shedding its skin. And he talked about this moment of the abundance of the continent, but also the kind of raping of the continent, but the opportunity and the kind of and the loss and a kind of warning. So the work is deliciously, like, you want to go straight into it. It just radiates light, but also it's a kind of warning. and it's such a powerful work. And of course, it's from his famous, collection of pieces. And he said, and I love this last quote that I'm going to leave you with. He says, "I saw the bottle caps as relating to the history of Africa in the sense that when the earliest groups of Europeans came to trade, they brought along rum originally from the West Indies, and that went to Europe and finally to Africa as 3 legs of the triangular trip. The drink caps that I use are not made in Europe. They're made in Nigeria, but they symbolize the bringing together the histories of these 2 great continents." And I'm going to leave it there, and let's have a discussion. Thank you.